March 17, 1943. Berlin. The heavy folder landed with a crack on the mahogany desk, so forceful that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris flinched. A splash of black coffee leapt from his porcelain cup, staining the very intelligence reports that, if discovered by the Gestapo, could mean his execution. The Abwehr chief's hand trembled slightly as he brushed the papers aside. Impossible. The Americans are feeding us propaganda through turned agents. That had to be the explanation. Through the tall windows of Abwehr headquarters, the grey morning light reflected off the Landwehr Canal, its surface rippling in silence. To anyone else, it was just another stretch of water. But Canaris could not look at it without remembering the body of Rosa Luxemburg dumped there 24 years earlier, the ghost of a different Germany, silenced by violence. Now, as the head of German military intelligence, he felt the same tremor of history, the sense that truths too dangerous to admit could drown a man just as swiftly as the canal. The report in his hands was unlike anything he had seen before. According to intercepted communications and testimony gathered from agents as far away as Mexico City, the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. Each bomber, a machine of staggering complexity, weighing 18 tons, containing 1.5 million individual parts, stitched together with 450,000 rivets and 30,000 separate components, was rolling off an assembly line faster than Germany could produce a Volkswagen Kübelwagen, a simple military car. Canaris had lived through decades of German industry, and he knew the precision it demanded. He had walked through shipyards, watched submarines rise from dry docks over years of labor, seen the sweat and the time and the resource drain. Now to be told that Americans were building machines of war as casually as sausages on a factory line, it offended not only logic, but the very German faith in methodical craftsmanship. Standing rigid before his desk was Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, the officer who had triple-checked the numbers. Heinz had been an operative long before the war, a man of discipline and cold certainty. Yet even he seemed unsettled. He had combed through the reports again and again. The numbers remained unchanged. They were either staring at the greatest triumph of American industry or the most elaborate deception campaign in modern history. What neither Canaris nor Heinz yet grasped was that this moment, this refusal to believe, would become one of the deadliest intelligence failures in history. By dismissing what their own networks were reporting, German intelligence was sowing the seeds of the Reich's defeat. For Canaris, it was not only a professional crisis, but a personal one. He had spent years walking a razor's edge between loyalty to his country and skepticism of the Nazi regime he served. He had cultivated double agents, whispered dissent in safe corners, all while trying to preserve a Germany he still loved from the abyss its leaders were dragging it toward. Now he held in his hands the most dangerous truth of all, that America's industrial capacity was not merely vast, but incomprehensible, an avalanche of steel, rivets, and manpower that could bury Germany alive. The Abwehr chief closed the folder, slowly, as if delaying the inevitable. The air in his office felt suddenly heavy, thick with smoke from the brass ashtray at his elbow. Outside, Berlin carried on with the rhythms of war, boots on cobblestones, sirens in the distance, the clatter of trams. None of it hinted at the industrial storm gathering across the Atlantic. Impossible, he muttered again, though in his gut he knew the numbers were no invention, and in that denial history began to turn. While Canaris sat in Berlin wrestling with disbelief, half a world away in Michigan, a miracle of engineering thundered to life. Willow Run was no ordinary plant. To call it a factory was to diminish its scale. Stretching nearly a mile in length, with walls of glass that caught the sun like a cathedral, it was the largest assembly line ever conceived for an aircraft. The brainchild of industrialist Henry Ford, this was the place where the methods of the automobile age collided with the needs of total war. When Ford had first promised he could mass-produce heavy bombers, Washington had been skeptical. Airplanes were delicate things, hand-built in small shops by skilled craftsmen who treated each fuselage like a bespoke creation. No one in the world believed a four-engine bomber, with its labyrinth of hydraulics and wiring, could be stamped out like a Model T. But the United States had one thing Germany never could replicate: space. At Willow Run, there was room to dream in steel. Train tracks carried in endless streams of aluminum, rubber, copper, and oil. Conveyor belts moved wings as casually as if they were fenders. Where one worker tightened bolts on an engine mount, another checked oxygen masks, while further down the line a cockpit canopy was lowered into place with the precision of a jeweler. By 1943, the plant was operating around the clock, a small city of laborers, engineers, and foremen. Women in overalls, their hair tied back with red kerchiefs, manned drill presses and rivet guns. Men too old for the draft worked side by side with teenagers barely out of school. It was the arsenal of democracy given flesh, ordinary Americans, transforming their sweat into machines of war. At full capacity, a completed B-24 Liberator rolled out of the hangar doors every 60 minutes. To German intelligence, the number was fantastical, an illusion conjured by Allied propagandists. Yet on the ground, it was routine. By the time Canaris closed his folder in Berlin, another bomber was already taxiing onto a runway in Michigan. Its engines coughing to life, the scale of Willow Run rippled outward. Rail lines carried the finished bombers to bases across the nation. Convoys delivered parts and materials with a rhythm as precise as a heartbeat. The American war machine was not improvisation. It was systematized chaos, a torrent of logistics, so vast that even its architects sometimes struggled to comprehend it. And the German refusal to believe in it was not merely an error of judgment. It was blindness born of arrogance. For years, Nazi leadership had assured itself that the decadent democracies of the West were incapable of total war. They saw Americans as soft, distracted by consumer goods and Hollywood fantasies. How could such people build an air fleet capable of blacking out the skies of Europe? The answer was unfolding hour by hour at Willow Run, and every bomber that lifted from American soil carried not just bombs, but the certainty that Germany's faith in its own superiority was a fatal illusion. Back in Berlin, the report made its slow, reluctant climb up the chain of command. Each level of authority looked at the numbers, frowned, and dismissed them as fantasy. To admit their validity would mean acknowledging a future no one wanted to face. At the Reich Air Ministry, Hermann Göring skimmed the summary with his usual impatience. His massive frame strained the uniform he had decorated with gaudy medals of his own design. Göring was a man intoxicated by power and flattery, but allergic to bad news. The Luftwaffe was his empire, and he would not allow anyone to suggest that it could be outbuilt, outflown, or outmatched. Americans, he scoffed, tossing the paper onto a table. They build cars, refrigerators, toys, bombers. Ha! Their factories are run by women and cripples. Do you think they can match the genius of German engineers? Around the room, officers nodded carefully, some out of fear, others because they truly believed it. To contradict Göring was to risk career and perhaps life. The Nazi regime thrived on delusion as much as terror, and in that chamber, truth withered. Canaris kept silent. He had seen enough of Göring's bluster to know that arguing would only harden resistance, yet inside he felt the weight of dread. He had read the data line by line. He had seen the corroborating signals. He knew enough of America to suspect the impossible might in fact be real. But what could he do? His position was already precarious. Himmler and the SS distrusted him, and whispers of treason followed him, like a shadow. So the report was buried. Officially, the Abwehr's findings were marked as unverified enemy propaganda. Unofficially, it was mocked in mess halls and staff meetings. A bomber an hour? Absurd. The Reich would crush the Allies long before such production mattered. This act of dismissal was more than bureaucratic negligence. It was a strategic blindfold. By underestimating the scale of American industry, the German High Command continued to launch campaigns as if the skies belonged to them. Fighter production remained modest, anti-aircraft defenses stretched thin, and plans were drawn with an optimism bordering on madness. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Willow Run kept building. The flood of steel and firepower was already on its way. And so in Berlin, arrogance became policy. Denial turned into doctrine. A war that might have been calculated with cold realism was instead fought on the fumes of wishful thinking. For Canaris, the irony was bitter. He had tried to warn them, but the truth he carried had drowned, just like so many inconvenient truths in Nazi Germany. The first time a wave of B-24 liberators appeared over occupied France, even veteran Luftwaffe pilots blinked in disbelief. It was August 1943. The morning sky over the rail yards at Regensburg began as a pale blue canvas, streaked with thin white clouds. Then on the horizon came a low vibration, like thunder still trapped beneath the earth. Civilians looked up from bread lines and rubble, shading their eyes. Farmers paused in their fields. Children, already accustomed to the war, sensed something different in the air. The formation emerged slowly at first, a dark smear against the sky. Then more still. Within minutes, the horizon was no longer horizon at all, but a moving wall of metal wings glinting in the sun, dozens, then hundreds. The Luftwaffe scrambled fighters in panic. Radio chatter burst across the channels, orders, curses, frantic attempts to count what they were seeing. 10, 20, 9, mehr, viel mehr. 10, 20, no, more, many more. The German pilots knew the B-17 flying fortress by now, but the B-24 was different. It was faster with longer range and it carried a heavier payload. To the defenders on the ground, they seemed endless. A tide rolling over the continent, anti-aircraft guns opened fire, black puffs of flak blossoming across the sky. The air filled with the metallic shriek of engines, the rattle of defensive guns, the thud of bombs finding targets. Entire factories shook, bridges crumpled, oil refineries roared into infernos that lit the night for miles. In Berlin, reports of the raids landed with the same disbelief as the production numbers months earlier. Goering raged at his generals. How had so many aircraft reached German airspace? Why were they not stopped? The answers were as obvious as they were ignored. Germany had underestimated. Germany had refused to prepare. For civilians, the raids meant terror. But for soldiers like Major Heinz, the officer who had first delivered the Willow Run report, the raids were vindication, though a hollow one. He had believed the numbers. He had carried them to his superiors. And now, as he stood among the ruins of a bombed marshalling yard, the truth roared overhead in the form of hundreds of liberators. Every 60 minutes, somewhere in Michigan, another bomber was born. Every hour, the skies over Europe grew heavier with steel. The impossible had become reality. By late 1943, the air war had changed shape. It was no longer a duel of fighter squadrons over battlefields. It was a war of factories, one side building, the other side crumbling. Each morning, from dozens of airfields in England, the liberators took off in tight formations, their wings almost brushing one another. The ground shook as entire squadrons roared into the sky, engines drumming like a war hymn. Crews barely in their 20s sat at their stations, scanning instruments, checking oxygen masks, adjusting the heavy machine guns mounted in every direction. For them, the flight ahead was hours of freezing winds, sudden terror, and the knowledge that one wrong turn could end in fire or the sea. But beyond their courage was something even more decisive: numbers. Every hour, Willow Run birthed another bomber. Every hour, American logistics ensured fuel, ammunition, and spare parts kept flowing. It was not just an air fleet, it was an assembly line stretched across an ocean. Germany could not match it. For every factory destroyed in Essen or Hamburg, it took months to rebuild, if the materials could even be found. Coal shortages strangled steel production. Synthetic fuel plants, once a marvel of German engineering, became frequent targets, sending shockwaves through the Wehrmacht's supply lines. Inside the Reich, disbelief began to falter. Reports now admitted that American bombers were arriving. In numbers no previous intelligence had predicted, yet the official line remained stubborn. Goering continued to boast that enemy losses were unsustainable, that the Luftwaffe was inflicting damage so severe the Allies would soon falter. But the reality in the skies told another story. For every bomber shot down, another rolled off the line in Michigan. For every squadron lost, replacements were already in training. The rhythm was merciless and it was breaking Germany's ability to fight. Admiral Canaris watched this unfold with grim vindication. He knew the mistake had been made months before, when the first reports were ignored. Now the Reich was living in the shadow of that arrogance. In the back rooms of Berlin, whispers grew louder. Perhaps the war could not be won. Perhaps the tide had turned not on the battlefield, but in a factory an ocean away. The war of factories was underway, and in that war, Germany was already defeated. It just did not know it yet. By early 1944, the German High Command could no longer ignore the truth. The skies above the Reich were crowded with American bombers, too many to count, too many to stop. The dream of air superiority had vanished, and with it went the last illusions of German invincibility. Faced with a flood of steel they could not match, Nazi leadership turned to desperation. If Germany could not outproduce, then perhaps it could out-innovate. Factories once devoted to steady production were redirected into frantic experiments. Engineers were ordered to design weapons that could change the war overnight. Jet fighters, rocket planes, guided missiles. The language of miracles replaced the language of strategy. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was rushed from blueprint to runway under the personal eye of Hitler himself. Its speed was unmatched, its firepower devastating. In theory, squadrons of these aircraft could tear through bomber formations like hawks among crows. But in practice, production was halting, fuel scarce, and pilots inexperienced. For every jet that reached the skies, dozens of liberators had already taken flight across the Atlantic. Then came the V-weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. They were marvels of terror, raining destruction on London, Antwerp, and Paris. Yet, even as they struck cities, they did not stop the bombers overhead. They were weapons of vengeance, not of victory. In Berlin, Göring's bravado grew hollow. His boasts that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the Reich sounded like cruel jokes to civilians cowering in basements as their cities burned. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, was now a shell of its former self. Its pilots dwindling, its fuel tanks dry. Admiral Canaris observed these frantic efforts with cold clarity. He saw in the jet prototypes and rocket launches not salvation, but panic. Technology could not compensate for blindness. Miracles could not erase the industrial reality America had built at Willow Run. And so Germany gambled its future on weapons. That came too late, in numbers too small, while the Allies pressed forward with the simple, crushing rhythm of mass production. Every hour, another bomber. Every day, another fleet. The miracle weapons might terrify, but they could not change the arithmetic of war. Spring 1944. In the villages of northern France, the night skies glowed with the silent passage of bombers. The people below could hear them even when they could not see them. A deep, unending drone, like the sound of approaching thunder that never stopped. Farmers whispered to their families, "Les forteresses," the fortresses. For the Allies, the strategy was clear. Before any invasion could land on the beaches of Europe, the skies had to be won. Rail lines, bridges, fuel depots, and coastal batteries all had to be hammered into dust. If D-Day was to succeed, Germany's ability to reinforce Normandy had to be broken long before the first soldier stepped onto sand. And so the liberators and their cousins, the B-17 flying fortresses, flew mission after mission. In May alone, more than 68,000 tons of bombs fell on France. Factories collapsed into rubble, train stations dissolved into craters, roads buckled and burned. The Nazi war machine, once so fearsome, began to choke on the destruction raining down from above. The Luftwaffe tried to resist. Young pilots were thrown into cockpits after only weeks of training. Jet prototypes were scrambled in handfuls. Anti-aircraft guns filled the skies with flak. Yet the torrent could not be stopped. For every German fighter that rose, there were 10 bombers overhead and 10 more behind them. To the soldiers waiting in England, men who would soon storm the beaches of Normandy, the sight was both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because the skies were a reminder of how vast the war had become. Reassuring because those bombers meant protection. It was the guarantee that when the invasion came, the German army would not fight alone. Their skies would be darkened by Allied wings. In Berlin, the reports grew grim. Entire regions of France were becoming impassable. Troop movements delayed, supply lines severed. The nightmare Canaris had feared a year earlier had arrived. American production was not just statistics on a page, it was thunder in the sky, hour after hour, with no end in sight. And then came June 6, 1944. When the landing craft pushed toward Normandy's shores, the soldiers above them were not alone. Overhead, a ceiling of Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, stretched as far as the east eye could see. German defenders looked up and realized the war in the air was lost. The invasion was not just a triumph of men and courage, it was the victory of a factory an ocean away, one bomber every hour. By the autumn of 1944, the Reich was a nation under siege from above. Daylight raids tore into the heart of Germany's industrial cities, Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt, while at night the skies glowed red as the RAF unleashed firestorms. Smoke hung over entire regions for weeks at a time, blotting out the sun. The once proud German rail system, the arteries of the war machine, lay shredded and twisted. Coal cars stood idle, factories silent, tanks stranded for lack of fuel. Ordinary, Germans felt the collapse in every corner of life. Bread lines grew longer, blackouts stretched through the nights. Mothers clutched their children in crowded shelters, listening to the roar of engines above, praying that tonight's bombs would fall on another city. Inside the military high command, despair seeped through the cracks of official reports. Commanders complained of shortages. No fuel for training flights, no steel for tanks, no rubber for tires. Even ammunition had to be rationed. The Reich, once intoxicated with visions of endless conquest, now faced a reality of scarcity, starvation, and exhaustion. And still the bombers came. Hour after hour, day after day. Willow Run, thousands of miles away, had long since passed its milestone of one bomber an hour. Its assembly lines had become a rhythm of inevitability. To Germany, it was like fighting a flood with bare hands. In Berlin, Goering's rants grew more hollow, his boasts reduced to whispers even his aides no longer believed. The Luftwaffe was a shadow, its pilots too young, its aircraft too few. Hitler demanded miracles, but miracles could not be mass-produced. Admiral Canaris, once ridiculed for believing the impossible, watched the collapse with grim vindication and quiet sorrow. He had tried to warn them, and they had laughed. Now the laughter was gone. In its place came silence, broken only by the drone of bombers overhead. By winter, entire cities lay in ruins. The Reich was no longer waging war, it was enduring annihilation. And still, the steel tide rolled on. By early 1945, the 1,000-year Reich had barely 1,000 hours left to live. The war map told the truth more plainly than any intelligence report. In the west, the Allies had crossed the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army was less than 50 miles from Berlin. Germany was being crushed from both sides, the jaws of inevitability snapping shut. And yet in Hitler's bunker beneath the Chancellery, the delusion still clung like a fever. Reports of production miracles, phantom divisions, and wonder. Weapons were read aloud with desperate faith. The Führer still dismissed the overwhelming American air fleets as exaggerations, still clung to the belief that a fractured democracy could not sustain such a war effort. Even in those final months, the truth was too bitter to swallow. Above ground, the evidence was undeniable. The skies thundered with bombers, thousands at a time, each one carrying the industrial might of a nation that Hitler had once mocked as soft, decadent, and incapable of sacrifice. The raids no longer merely targeted factories. They shattered. Cities tore apart transport hubs, flattened refineries. They dismantled not only Germany's ability to fight, but its very capacity to exist. For the people below, survival became the only war left to fight. Families dug deeper shelters, clung to what little food was left, and prayed not for victory but for an end. The Reich's grand speeches had lost all meaning in the face of firestorms and hunger. Inside the intelligence ranks, despair reached its peak. Men like Canaris and Oster, who had tried to sound the alarm years earlier, were no longer alive to see their predictions vindicated. They had been executed as traitors, martyrs to a truth their leaders refused to hear. Others, silenced by fear or resignation, simply watched as their nation collapsed under the weight of mathematics they had once tried to explain. By the spring of 1945, American bombers blackened the skies over Germany with such frequency that their presence became as natural as clouds. To soldiers at the front, they were a constant reminder that resistance was futile. To civilians, they were the sound of doom approaching with mechanical precision. To historians, they remain the most visible symbol of a war decided not only by courage in the field, but by factories across the ocean, where democracy had turned assembly lines into weapons of inevitability. The Reich was dying not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of belief in the truth it already had. And as April 1945 dawned, with Hitler retreating deeper into his bunker and the Allies closing in from every direction, the final lesson of Willow Run stood clear. Denial was as deadly as any bomb. April 1945. Berlin was no longer a capital, it was a graveyard in waiting. Streets once filled with parades of victory were now choked with rubble and refugees. The air stank of smoke, cordite, and despair. Every corner bore scars of bombardment. Entire districts were erased, as if a giant hand had swept them from the map. The Allies had long since claimed the skies. Thousands of bombers passed overhead in endless waves, their formations so vast that Berliners swore the sun disappeared. When they came, they had bombed Hamburg until fire consumed the city, Dresden until stone itself melted, and now they circled above the Reich's heart. For every German who looked skyward, Willow Run's shadow was there, proof of an industrial rhythm that had never faltered. One bomber an hour, one blow after another, blow after. A tide that could not be stopped. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler clung to illusions even as the walls trembled from artillery fire. He had been shown photographs, manifests, even film of the Willow Run plant years earlier, and dismissed them all as tricks. Now, as the Red Army's guns shook the foundations of his fortress, the sound of Allied bombers still rumbling in the distance, that denial seemed grotesque. Yet he never admitted it. To accept the truth would have been to accept defeat, not just military defeat, but ideological annihilation. On the streets, ordinary Berliners carried a different truth. They no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of survival, of finding water, of protecting children, of burying the dead before the next raid. Their Reich was gone, reduced to ash and ruin, and above them the bombers droned like clockwork, mechanical angels of death, summoned from factories thousands of miles away where free citizens worked double shifts not for conquest, but to end the nightmare. By the end of April, Berlin was encircled. Hitler's empire, which was meant to last 1,000 years, would not last the month. The final irony was brutal. The Reich had drowned in intelligence it refused to believe, destroyed not just by Allied firepower, but by its own refusal to accept reality. And as Berlin burned, one could almost hear the hum of Willow Run's assembly lines echoing across the ocean, steady, relentless, inevitable. April 30th, 1945. In the depths of the Führer bunker, the air was heavy with diesel fumes, stale smoke, and the quiet resignation of those who knew the end had come. Outside, the thunder of Soviet artillery was unrelenting, growing louder each hour as shells rained down upon what remained of Berlin. The city above was no longer a city, only ruins and ghosts. Hitler, pale and trembling, shuffled through the corridors like a shadow of himself. His once fiery speeches had been reduced to muttered fragments of rage and denial. He still spoke of phantom divisions that did not exist, of secret weapons that would never come, of an American war machine he had always dismissed as propaganda. Yet even as he clung to delusion, the evidence roared outside. The skies still filled with Allied bombers, products of the very factory he had laughed at. Those in the bunker who had dared to see the truth understood the irony. Germany had not been undone by a single battle, but by a slow grinding inevitability. Willow Run had outproduced an entire nation's dreams of conquest. Every bomber that rose from its runways had carried not just bombs, but a message that free societies, when challenged, could summon strength far beyond what dictators imagined. In those final hours, Hitler dictated his last testament, blaming Everyone but himself, his generals, his people, the Jews, even fate. He never once admitted what the evidence had made plain, that Germany had been buried under mountains of steel and fire forged in American factories, that he had lost the war not because his enemies deceived him, but because he had deceived himself. When the gunshot echoed in the bunker that afternoon, it marked not only the end of a man, but the collapse of an ideology that had refused to face reality. Above ground, the Red Army raised their banners over Berlin's ruins. In the skies, the bombers still came, a final punctuation to the war Germany had begun, but could never hope to win. The truth of Willow Run had outlived Hitler. It had marched across the skies, dropped its payloads, and written history in fire. And while the bunker fell silent, the assembly lines across the Atlantic continued their steady rhythm, proof that democracy had built more than planes. It had built victory itself. May 1945. The guns finally fell silent. Across Europe, weary soldiers lowered their rifles, and the skies cleared of contrails for the first time in years. Germany, once the terror of the continent, lay broken, its cities in ruins, its people scattered, its leaders dead or captured. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12. In the days following Hitler's suicide, the last of his generals clung briefly to the hope of negotiation. But the truth was unavoidable. They had nothing left. No fuel, no weapons, no factories. The Allies had ground the Reich to dust with a force that seemed inexhaustible. Willow Run's shadow stretched into every shattered street, every smouldering ruin, every surrender document signed. At Allied headquarters, crates of captured German intelligence were sorted and studied. Among them lay reports once mocked, now vindicated, detailed analyses of America's industrial might, warnings that had been dismissed as exaggerations. The photographs of Willow Run, rows of gleaming bombers rolling out of the hangar, 1 per hour, were rediscovered by intelligence officers. What had once been called propaganda was now revealed as prophecy ignored. Some German officers, broken and bitter, admitted in captivity what they had denied in uniform. "We could not compete," one confessed. "It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket." Another, leafing through photographs of Willow Run under guard, muttered, "We laughed at this. We should not have laughed." For the Allies, Willow Run became more than a factory. It was a symbol of victory through production, proof that a free people could outbuild tyranny. Its steady rhythm, 1 bomber an hour, 24 hours a day, had written the end of the Reich long before the Red Army stormed Berlin. The surrender was signed, but the echoes of the assembly line still lingered. They were not just echoes of machines, but of a lesson carved deep into history. Wars are not won, only by battles, but by the will and the capacity to sustain them. And that truth had buried Hitler's empire as surely as any bomb. When the surrender came, Willow Run did not fall silent overnight. For months its machines still hummed, finishing contracts, repairing aircraft, preparing for what might come next. Yet already, people began to see the plant for what it truly was, not just a factory, but a monument to a kind of power the world had never known. Historians would later argue that the war had been decided not only on the beaches of Normandy or the streets of Stalingrad, but in places like Willow Run. Here workers, men and women, immigrants and farmers' sons, African Americans and recent arrivals from Europe, had stood shoulder to shoulder on an assembly line that never rested. They had built a tide of steel, so vast that no dictator's dreams could withstand it. For America, Willow Run became a reminder of what democracy could achieve when it set its mind to the task. Unlike the Reich, which had chained itself to ideology and denial, the United States had embraced scale, efficiency, and the raw energy of its people. Where Hitler had laughed at the idea of a bomber an hour, America had simply gone and done. Here in the ruins of post-war Germany, that fact became undeniable. German officers who once scoffed at the reports now admitted them with bitter clarity. The Reich had never truly stood a chance. Not once Willow Run and factories like it came online. The bomber fleets that had blackened their skies were not miracles of strategy or luck. They were the inevitable product of a society that believed in building as fiercely as it believed in fighting. Decades later, the plant would stand as a relic of both triumph and transformation. It told a story not only of victory in war, but of the quiet, relentless force of industry. It showed that wars could be decided not just by soldiers, but by riveters and machinists, by night shifts and conveyor belts, by the unglamorous but unstoppable rhythm of production. And so, in the shadow of Willow Run, one lesson endured. Dictators may plan wars, but free people, when united, can build the means to end them. In the end, Willow Run was more than steel rivets and machinery. It was an answer to tyranny, built not by generals or kings, but by ordinary hands working extraordinary hours. Its steady rhythm, one bomber every hour, was not just production, but defiance. A message to the world that free people, when tested, could outbuild, outlast, and overcome the darkest ambitions of dictators. The Reich had fallen not only because its armies were defeated in battle, but because it had failed to understand the true weight of democracy's strength. Hitler's laughter at the idea of Willow Run was his undoing, for in that laughter lay his blindness. He saw propaganda where there was only fact, fantasy where there was resolve. And when reality arrived, thousands of bombers blackening the skies, it was too late. Willow Run's legacy stretched beyond the war. It showed that industry could be a weapon as decisive as any army, and that freedom, when harnessed collectively, could generate forces greater than any one man's will. In its hangars, amid the roar of engines and the clatter of tools, history was written as surely as on any battlefield. Today, the story of Willow Run is remembered not merely as a chapter of World War II, but as a warning and a promise. A warning to those who would underestimate open societies, dismiss the power of ordinary citizens, or laugh at what they cannot imagine. And a promise that when democracy is threatened, its strength is not found in a single leader, but in the millions, willing to build, to fight, and to endure. As the echoes of the war faded and the world turned toward peace, Willow Run stood as proof of one truth, simple yet eternal, that the will of free people, multiplied 1,000-fold, can forge machines of victory, and that such will, once awakened, is unstoppable.